bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the April 29th, 2025 episode. My guests, as those who are watching on YouTube can see, my guests this week are Rebecca Darling and Brad Elphick. They're both partners of mine in Novogradac's Metro Atlanta office. They're also two of our leading experts on the new markets tax credit, which is a bit of foreshadowing as to where we're going to go with the episode today. Yeah, we're going to discuss 5 hot topics or key issues that all of us in the new markets tax credit community are thinking about these days. And those 5 are: 1, we'll review where we stand with respect to the executive order that President Trump issued back on March 14th, which had the potential to have adverse effects for the CDFI Fund and by derivatively new markets tax credits. 2nd, we'll talk about permanency. As our regular listeners know and regular viewers, the new market tax credit is scheduled to expire at the end of this year, and there's efforts underway to make the new market tax credit permanent. The 3rd item, which you might have guessed if you were thinking what are the 5 items we're going to talk about today, has to do with where we are with the $10 billion round that we're in the midst of. The 4th item we wanted to discuss is the April 17th deadline for reporting equity investments and loans or equity investments in qualified businesses. There's a deadline on April 17th for those that have applied in the $10 billion round. And what do we think the level of activity was? We don't actually have the information from the April 17th reporting, but Brad can share some insights on that. And then 5th, who doesn't like compliance? So our 5th topic is the overview of the recently released updated version of the compliance and monitoring FAQs for new market tax credits that was released by the CDFI Fund. So those are the 5 topics that we want to cover. And I will remind our listeners before we get into that discussion that if you want to learn more about today's topics and others, as well as network with those working in the new market tax credit community, I remind you that our New Market Tax Credit Conference, our annual DC conference, is coming up June 5th and 6th in Washington, DC. Also note that one of our keynotes is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith. We're pleased to have him back. We'll be in the midst of the tax bill that's working its way through Congress. So we couldn't be more pleased to have the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee joining our conference at that time. If you want to learn more about that conference and any of our other upcoming conferences, please visit our website at Novoco, that's Novoco.com. But with that said, let's get back to today's show. We have 5 important topics. Rebecca, Brad, and I have a lot to discuss. So if you're ready, let's get started. Rebecca and Brad, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mike.
So Brad, this is your 19th appearance on Tax Credit Tuesday. And Rebecca, this is your 9th. And the last time each of you were on the program, you were on together as well. I was, though, not there. As Brad, thank you for sitting in as a host for me. And of course, you talked about new market tax credits like you'll talk about today. Before we jump into the 5 topic areas, I wanted each of you to describe briefly some of the services that you provide to Novogradac clients. And Rebecca, let's start with you.
Sure. So I've been with the firm for 20 years now. I focus both on the community development space as well as affordable housing. My clients include community development entities or CDEs, developers, businesses, and investors. When I look at the different type of work that I do, especially when it comes to new markets, I assist clients with audits and tax returns, compliance, and also on their allocation applications. Brad.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rebecca and Mike. I'm just glad that Peter Lawrence or Tony Grapponi aren't on today so that I can at least get a little bit closer to how many appearances that they've had on the podcast as well. So appreciate you acknowledging how many times I've been on here. I'm a sucker for these things, apparently. But similar to what Rebecca was saying, I do all of the same things that she does. A couple other things that I do in addition to those is I also do a lot of transaction consulting and financial forecast preparation. Our team works on many of the transactions that our clients do for using new market tax credits. And also I host the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, which is an industry-based group that works on many of the issues that we'll cover today, as well as many others, and would encourage everyone to check us out and become members if you're interested.
Thank you for that. Thank you both. And I will encourage our viewers, those in our audience who are members of the New Market Tax Credit Working Group that work in community development, to reach out to you about joining the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. And thank you, Brad, for your leadership in the New Market Tax Credit area in terms of public policy, regulatory guidance, in general, transferring information and sharing information. I know I myself find it eminently useful, the work that you deal with the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, and appreciate the leadership that you show there.
I appreciate that. And also just one more plug in terms of sharing information, we do share a lot of information also on LinkedIn and on X. So you can find out more there too.
Great. Now let's start with Rebecca. And Rebecca, as you know, as does Brad, on March 14th, President Trump issued an executive order. And the order has been described by many somewhat inaccurately. So hopefully I'll do an adequate job of describing it accurately. And in that executive order, the president called for the elimination of all non-statutory components and functions of 7 federal government entities. Now, the 7 entities, the reason why we're talking about it is, of course, that one of the 7 was the CDFI Fund. And the CDFI Fund does oversee the New Markets Tax Credit and the Capital Magnet Fund, among a number of other incentives and programs. Now, as I said, the executive order called for the elimination of all non-statutory components and functions of the various agencies, which then led to a reaction among the community development community with respect to the CDFI Fund to try to document how what the CDFI Fund does do is statutory, as well as to be concerned about this as being maybe a shot across the bow, if you will, that if you're limiting non-statutory components, what might come next. So with that as background, Rebecca, if you could describe for our audience the broader sort of community's reaction to that executive order and how you assess the level of concern we all have with respect to the viability of the CDFI Fund going forward.
Sure. Yeah, we saw the executive order come out, and I think myself, similar to others, kind of had that initial moment of, all right, well, it just says non-statutory components of functions. Well, clearly the New Market Tax Credit, as well as the other CDFI Fund programs, are legally authorized by statute. To a certain degree, you always have a moment of breath, right? Okay, it's fine. But anyone that's worked in new market for any amount of time knows we don't rest on our laurels. There's always education and communication and industry involvement that needs to happen. And so even though we can say, all right, well, we know new markets is legally authorized by statute, we still need to make sure that clear communication and support is evidence, right? If there isn't support, if there isn't this overwhelming communication about how wonderful this program is, then why are we keeping it? Why are there going to be efforts? And so I think there was a really great reaction from the industry immediately saying, hey, this is what new markets is. This is what the CDFI Fund does. This isn't something that we want to get rid of. I think the other thing to keep in mind is part of the executive order was focused on the statutory component, but the other part is focusing on efficiency. And that's something that our efforts in the working group and others have been very focused on. How can we make the new market tax credit incentive more efficient? having the CDFI fund be more efficient. And we have a lot of communication with the fund. And I think they have been so wonderful and constantly evolving what they're doing on their side. But I think this just highlights those efforts need to continue. I think the other piece that I was really pleased by was in the week following the executive order, Congress issued a bipartisan letter supporting the CDFI fund and the new market tax credit. And so seeing that support and also just the fact it's bipartisan, that's always something that I've really been pleased about the new markets credit. We always have that bipartisan support. And then lastly, the Department of Treasury, so that's the department that's over the CDFI fund, responded back to OMB, which they needed to do and say, hey, we're legally required here, we're authorized. And it was just a very short and sweet memo saying, hey, we're moving forward. Brad, what were some of your other kind of reactions from the industry?
Well, it was interesting because it came in the dead of night, or it felt like it was the dead of night right after the CR was passed. And, we had this big event where the continuing resolution was passed on the same day. And we wake up Saturday morning to this executive order that I think truly caught the industry by surprise, that there was this executive order that included the CDFI fund as part of its list of 7, as Mike mentioned. And so that really got everyone moving over the weekend. And I think, as you mentioned, the speed at which there was communication from Treasury and Congress in support of the CDFI fund, I think was truly evident of how much everyone was caught off guard, but was willing to step up and support and say, wait, what's going on here? Why is the CDFI fund of all things being targeted? Secretary Bessent in his confirmation was asked about CDFI fund, and CDFIs and others have offered their support as well. So it didn't really make sense that they were included. It almost seemed like maybe they didn't know it was coming either. And I think that was part of the reason why it was comforting to get those comments in support of the CDFI fund so quickly. So I think that one of the other things that I think that the industry did a fairly good job of is responding in a unified voice. And I think that that's important this year of all years, as we're on the precipice of the program expiring at the end of 2025, is that we don't want to have all of these voices out there with different views and viewpoints and such that might muddy the waters a little bit in terms of the importance of the CDFI fund and new market tax credits and whether or not the sky is falling. There was a little bit of that going on. And I think that as we've seen, with the efforts of DOGE and other aspects of the CDFI fund related to contracts, that there can be, everyone's anxious right now. We're in the middle of a $10 billion round. And so there's definitely some anxiety about the future. But I think that with a unified voice, the industry was able to respond, and the CDFI fund and Treasury responded clearly, as you said, with a shortened memo saying there's really not much to discuss here because everything is statutorily authorized. We're going to do everything that we can to honor the efforts to increase efficiencies. And they left it at that. Now, I will say, leaving it at that still leaves question about what does that mean to kind of honor the notion of how are they going to increase efficiencies. And I had referenced this in an article in which I was interviewed for in terms of there are ways to attack a program that's statutorily authorized without actually getting rid of the program. And so if there were truly efforts to target new market tax credits, there are ways that someone could try to reduce the staffing levels, for example, add the CDFI fund to levels where it made it very difficult to administer the program. I think that while that is a concern, I don't think that's truly something that we expect to happen in the future, especially based upon the conversations that we've had with members in Treasury stating that's not their goal. So I think that's been helpful to have that line of communication and reassurance from within Treasury saying like, look, we like the CDFI fund. We like what it does. We like new market tax credits. And our goal is to continue administering it as we have in the past.
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Brad. Only a couple of things I would add is that one of the listeners or members of the audience right now might be thinking, yes, new market tax credit is a statutory provision, Section 45 Cap D, but is the CDFI fund's role itself a statutory provision or not? And I just wanted to share with the audience, as both of you know, that there is statutory language where there's a reference to the CDFI Fund overseeing the new market tax credit program. So there is statutory language linking the CDFI Fund with new market tax credits, because initially there was concern about, does this mean that the IRS should be administering the CDFI Fund's role as administering would go away? And the other thing I will note is we do expect sort of top line numbers for the president's budget sometime over the next week or two. And by the middle to end of May, a fuller budget. And I do expect the CDFI Fund budget not to be what the broader community would like it to be. And I would just note that's a starting point, and that it'll ultimately be a question as to what the funding levels are that get approved by the House and the Senate. And I agree with Brad from the standpoint that ultimately, I think the CDFI Fund will have adequate levels of funding. Obviously, it depends on what your definition of adequate is, but I expect it to sort of continue, not too broadly different in the way in which it's been operating now, at least with respect to the new market tax credit. With that, let's move on. That's topic one, or 5 topics. Number 2, we made reference to the new market tax credit scheduled to expire at the end of this year. We're in the midst of this $10 billion double round. And there's a lot that we could say about the push for permanency. And we only have limited time. But Brad, please share your ideas and your observations about where we are right now in terms of getting permanency for the new market tax credit.
Mike, I felt like that reminder that we have limited time was directed at me. Well, yeah. So as you mentioned, and as I said before, the credit expires at the end of 2025. And so there is a lot of attention on an indefinite extension of the program. And so we were happy to see back in February, the New Market Tax Credit Extension Act of 2025 was introduced by Representatives Claudia Tenney and Terry Sewell in the House, and then Senator Steve Daines and Senator Mark Warner in the Senate. And essentially, this was a rollover of the previous version of the bill that had been introduced in previous Congresses. So that it was an important first step, and there has been great bicameral and bipartisan support for the tax credit, as there has been in the past. But as Rebecca reminds us, we can't rest on our laurels, as we've seen in 2017, for example. Just because you don't hear anything doesn't mean that something bad can't happen and that we don't have to be on the defense. And so it is important that us as an industry are focused on getting members of Congress to support the current version of that bill. And in that bill, again, as a reminder, it calls for the indefinite extension to make the tax credit an indefinite part of the Internal Revenue Code. It calls for $5 billion adjusted for inflation going forward, which I think is important. As we've seen, there's tremendous appetite for this credit. And as we're seeing now in a $10 billion round, $5 billion adjusted for inflation, or even more, I think could be absorbed. And also there is the alternative minimum tax exemption, which would ultimately open the doors for individual investors to become part of the investor pool. And as we'll talk about at our conference in June, I'm sure on the investor panel, the different factors that can have upward pressures on pricing. Obviously, more appetite for the credit or competition would have upward pressure on pricing. So that's where the current version of the bill is. As I mentioned, there's tremendous support for it. There are a couple of other bills that have been out there that could be potential add-ons. I think that's important as we are looking at permanency. Is there also an opportunity to expand on what is in that extension bill? You have things like the Rural Jobs Act that could possibly be considered, which would give additional allocation authority for investment directed into rural areas. There's also a Tribal Tax and Investment Reform Act that could potentially garner more allocation into tribal areas. And then Mike's favorite add-on, I think, is the elimination of the basis adjustment. And for those that know and have been listening to the podcast or reading our publications, you know the importance of getting the basis adjustment eliminated in order to put the new market tax credit kind of from a policy perspective on a level playing field with other tax credits, and would also be one of those factors that could ultimately put upward pressure on pricing. So I think that's an important component that as we're in this year of tax reform and budget reconciliation process, these are potential other things that we could see added on through that process, in addition to the currently introduced legislation for the permanent extension of the credit.
Great. Thank you for that, Brad. I have a few observations, but I'll let you speak first, Rebecca, if anything you wanted to add.
Sure. I think one thing when I think about this opportunity for a permanent extension is the stability that I think it would have on industry. We've talked a lot about efficiency. Certainly, there's been a major focus on government efficiencies. I think permanency really ties right into that, right? We would see efficiency both at a federal and CDFI fund level, but I also think that would also funnel down to the industry and, transaction level as well. And to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, Brad, we always have new members of Congress. There's a lot of education that happens. And whether you've got someone who's not familiar with new markets or is very familiar, I think it's still important for CDEs to be inviting their members of Congress to groundbreakings, to funded projects, because I think it's so easy to pass by a new market tax credit funded project and not even realize that it was funded with new markets and just the impact that it has on their communities. So I think that's important. And then I also just want to remind listeners that President Trump already has supported the new market tax credit in the past. So back in 2019, we had a 1-year extension. And then obviously in 2020, we had the 5-year extension. So I certainly won't rest on the fact that we've had support in the past. So we're guaranteed support going forward. I don't think you can ever say that. But that does give me a little bit more comfort that we hopefully can move forward in the right direction this year.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Brad. And all I'll add is for the audience members, as you're sort of watching the machinations of the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, and then ultimately the bill that makes its way through the House and the Senate, and then potentially to the president's desk. The Ways and Means Committee is expected to come out with a bill first, and then it'll go to the Senate. And I expect the Senate to make changes to the bill. So certainly don't think whatever you see coming out of the Ways and Means Committee is the final product. And I say that in part because I don't want to go into a deep dive of budget reconciliation, what it means, and the fact that the Senate's going down a current policy approach and the rest. But I will just note that with respect to new market tax credits, given the dynamics at play, the rules at play, beyond that there is the ability to get permanency as opposed to a multi-year extension. So the way in which it's working its way through the Senate would allow for permanency. However, it would be permanency without keeping it exactly as it is. So there would have to be other adjustments like inflation, basis adjustment, AMT offsets, some of the other provisions. So I do expect once we get a bill out of the House and then it gets to the Senate and it comes out of the Senate, that it'll look slightly different, hopefully, much better than it is right now, but that a mere permanency is likely not what we would see. And
Mike,
go ahead.
How important do you think it is a lot of people are comparing this process this year to 2017, obviously. And I think a lot of people maybe don't understand as well as you do and others about the difference in the leadership where there's the chairman of the House Ways and Means this time around versus last time. Do you have any kind of sense of how important that is now and how that's different from 2017?
Well, 2017 was all about, you were out until you were in the sense that it was about simplification and the rest, and provisions were generally out until they were in. And that's why the Ways and Means Committee sent a bill to the Senate that had lots of community development credits that were going to expire. And then the Senate put them back in. Here you're in until you're out, if you will. And the fact that new markets, expires the same time a number of these other TCJA provisions expired, all the rest puts us in pretty good shape. And the leadership of Ways and Means in the Senate support the new market tax credit and the rest. So I feel like we're definitely on the advocacy and expansion and permanency side and not so much about, mere survival. That being said, there's a lot of dynamics at play, and believe it or not, there'll be some politics as well. So we can't rest on our laurels and take all this for granted. And then we will have a future podcast once we get, the Ways and Means bill out, and then obviously one in the Senate, does their work. And we're trying to decide within the Tax Credit Tuesday as to at which points in time should we have a follow-up targeted podcast, because it's going to be such a moving target. We want to do something that is useful and not aging too fast, such that by the time we record it, it's no longer accurate. But we'll definitely have breaking news emails as well as a blog post and the rest to keep folks up to date on what's happening.
And a keynote from Chairman Smith.
Exactly. We'll hear it directly from Chairman Smith at the New Market Tax Conference in June. So please join us there, as I noted earlier. So let's move on now to the $10 billion double round. As you were mentioning with the executive order, DOGE efforts, and the rest, there's been a lot of concern about the $10 billion round. Is it still moving forward? When could we expect awards and the like? Rebecca, please share with our audience where you think we are with that $10 billion double round.
Sure. So, I think with all the activity that we've seen, I think many of us in the industry were initially concerned, are we going to see a delay, a slowdown in the process? And from all our conversations with the CDFI Fund, they've really been doing a fantastic job of just keeping everything moving and staying on track. They've announced there were 216 applications submitted, which is right about where I was thinking we would see it. And so that was helpful to see. I also think if we're looking forward and starting to kind of guess, we've got about 20 more applications submitted in this round than we did in the 2023 round. Plus, we're about a month later as far as when the deadline was. Previously, we had December. Now we had, late January. So, Brad and I really love throwing guesses out there and predictions. And so I think, right now we've heard that they've been making great progress. Reviews are in progress. So I'm thinking that we'll still have a fall award date. That's still what's on the CDFI Fund's website. And I'm thinking it'll just be a bit later than we saw in the last round. So my guess is before Thanksgiving, probably early November, if I had to guess. What about you, Brad? Do you want to?
Well, Rebecca,
prediction?
I think you're being way too humble when you said that the 216 number of applications submitted was right around where we were thinking, considering you said specifically on our podcast 215. And was only one off. So kudos to you. I think I was much more bullish that there would be more applications submitted, but with the change that the applicants had to be a certified CDE before the NOAA, I think definitely limited that. As you said, with all of these hiccups, whether it be rumors that contracts for external reviewers were under consideration and possible elimination, the executive order and so forth, we get lots of questions of what does this mean for the $10 billion round? And as you said, the CDFI Fund has been pretty steadfast in their responses that business is continuing as usual right now. And I think that's good, a good signal from the CDFI Fund. I think that they've signaled that the contracts, were essentially signed off and that process is continuing. So similar to you, I think that sometime before Thanksgiving, we've been seeing it in September the last couple of years. When they say fall, they actually have hit a day or two before fall. So I do think it will be early fall. And so I agree with you. I think before Thanksgiving would be a good guess.
And let me actually ask each of you, if I was to predict that there would be 100 awards, out of the 216, that 100 would receive an award. And I'll start with you, Brad. Would you take the over or the under? If I said there will be 100 awards.
I'm going to go over. I'm going to take the over.
By how much?
So if we're saying 100 awards, because I think that's what we saw with the $5 billion. So I definitely think that it's going to be more than 100. I think it's probably going to be closer to 130, if I had to guess, is my gut, is kind of where I've been leaning.
Okay.
Which, then factors into what is the average award size and all of that. So it will be interesting to see if the fund is.
Okay. You put it at 130, Rebecca, over or 130.
I'm going to go just over Brad. I think we might see just a little bit higher. I don't think you're far off though, Brad. So I'd say like 140.
Great. Thank you both. And I'll look forward to you being back on the podcast to share the reality versus the prediction. So on April 17th, getting to our next topic.
Well, did you have a guess, Mike? Were you taking the over?
Yeah, I felt like the over is a safe bet.
Yeah.
I
agree.
But the getting on to the fourth topic, April 17th was the deadline for CDEs that did submit an application in this current round to report the qualified equity investments that they have made, as well as the loans to equity investments, qualified businesses that they had made based upon prior awards, and as a condition to be able to have their current application be continued to be reviewed, as well as, that data can also potentially impact the size of the awards. That data, isn't available yet, obviously the results of it. And when the April 30th QEI reports do come out, we'll get some of that data. That being said, Brad, you work with, and we at Novogradac obviously work with a large number of clients. What's your take in terms of the level or the volume of activity in April?
I think that the volume of activity in April will not be similar to the volume of activity in March of last year, if I had to guess. And part of that is that last year, the time period from the NOAA to the QEI date was 180 days. This round, it was 210 days. So you have an extra month. And so what we've seen in the transaction flow of deals closing is that activity, rather than landing all in the month for which the deadline occurs, is that it was spread over March and April this year, which for all of us preparing financial forecasts for these deals, obviously it helps to smooth it out over, a longer period of time. So I think that with that, we saw some smoothing and extension over more months. And I think too, one of the changes that the CDFI Fund made related to the QEI QLICI issuance requirement was a lower threshold for applicants who received awards in the prior round. Previously, non-rural CDs had a 20% requirement, whereas this round they had a 10% requirement. And so most CDEs aren't doing, just enough deals to get to that threshold percentage. They're usually doing a couple more in case a deal falls out so that they can be ensured that they meet the threshold. With 10%, we saw, I think, more CDEs making a decision earlier on to allow a deal to go beyond the deadline and not have to try to close by that deadline, which took some of the pressure off. And that was the argument that we were making about the requirement in the first place, is that it was putting this undue pressure on the closing timeline for some of these transactions. So I think that from our experience, we would like to thank the CDFI Fund for making that change, because I think it did some ultimate good in terms of the ability to give deals that needed more time, that time to close without putting that undue pressure on it. So I think with that, you may not see some of those transactions that were rushing to a deadline before close in April of this year, like they did in prior years. However, we, extrapolating from information that we have, overall, I would say that you could see it's still potentially a 15 to 20% increase in the total volume of transactions closed through April of this year compared to April of last year.
Right. Thank you, Brad. Thank you for your leadership with the Market Tax Credit Working Group and so many comment letters about those deadlines. Rebecca, any additional thoughts?
I think the only other thing that I want to remind folks about is that not only do you need to close QEI and QLICI by April 17th, but you also have to complete that online certification, that interim certification. so that the CDFI fund is where. And so that was last Thursday, April 24th. And so I think once we have all of that final data, I'm interested to see how much was closed because, Brad, we saw from the QEI report, the fund issues monthly, at that end of March report, we were already more than 10% of the 2023 round deployed, but obviously not every CDE had met their threshold requirement yet. So I think it'll be interesting. I definitely saw the recommendations that we have received from the industry and passed along to the fund. I think we saw those improvements. But I also think one of the things that I really appreciate about the extra time that the fund provided was you've got to remember once a CDE receives an award, they have to have a signed allocation agreement before they can actually close any transaction. And in many cases, that could take a month. And so it was really helpful to essentially get that month back, right? And say, you can't even close anything. So you may be starting deals, but sometimes there was even that pressure of, I need a signed allocation agreement because I can't close this deal because I've got to get so much done. So I think both pieces really lended itself to a lot of great transactions closing, and we'll continue to see that going forward.
And Rebecca, your point that you just made about the allocation agreement is even more important for new CDEs that haven't completed an allocation agreement yet and don't have that experience. To be able to have that extra time, I think is really important for newer CDEs as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. Let's move on to our fifth topic, one near and dear to all of our hearts, and that's compliance and monitoring. And there was a release by the CDFI Fund, an updated version of the compliance and monitoring FAQ. Rebecca, share some of the highlights that our audience may not be aware of that this should be in terms of changes to that FAQ.
Sure. So we saw the updated version. I think Brad might have been the first one to tell everybody because he loves being on the fund's website. So he got the pleasure of the announcement, which was awesome. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I think both Brad and I had was we didn't see a lot of changes to the FAQ document, which is what we were expecting. We saw some clarifications and improvements, but the fund has made a concerted effort to align the FAQ document with the application and other guidance. And so I think that streamlining effect has really been beneficial. We only saw one new question added, and that was related to something new that we saw in this most recent double round application related to areas of deep distress. And so if you remember, if you applied in this most recent round and committed a percentage of your allocation to deploy to areas of deep distress, you need to be willing to sign an allocation agreement potentially for that percentage. And so once we see those allocation agreements come out, it'll be memorialized there. And so that was some good clarification. What I just want to remind everyone, when you think about compliance and you think about the new market tax credit, it's so important to look at all of the information, not just one document. So I kind of use material events as an example, right? If you have what you think might be a material event, there's an instruction form you go through. If you look at the compliance and monitoring FAQ and the examples they provide of potential material events, there are more items on that FAQ than there are on the instruction form. Just like in the application, when Brad and I are working on the allocation applications and reading those, we'll go back to the compliance and monitoring FAQ and point out various pieces to make sure that you as a CDE are looking at all of the pieces as a whole. So although there aren't a lot of changes, I think it's important for CDEs to walk through, make sure they're familiar with the changes Brad sent around to the working group members, the strike throughs and all the updates. And for most, I think they would think, oh, a bullet point went away, no big deal. But each of those pieces are important. And I think the last thing you want to do is get into a position with the CDFI fund when you're not compliant, because then although you might not have recapture, you may not be eligible for future allocations. And that's certainly not what you would want to do.
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. Any follow-up, Brad?
No, I think Rebecca did a good job of covering that. The one reminder that I have for CDEs, if you do have any compliance questions, to submit a service request in AMIS as your form of communication with the CDFI Fund. It gives them an ability to track it. And also, I think that they use those to update the future versions of the FAQ document. But it also allows you to have a document that shows what the CDFI Fund's response is and keep that in your folder. But we have also seen with working group members sharing some of those responses, how sometimes those responses may not necessarily answer the question sufficiently. And we've reached out on behalf of the industry to try to get further clarification on certain issues. That's something else that's important when you're looking at these service request responses is, does it ultimately make sense in relation to your specific set of fact patterns?
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Rebecca. Before we bring this to a close, I wanted each of you to share, beyond Tax Credit Tuesday podcast, additional resources that you think our audience should be turning to learn more and stay abreast of new market tax credit matters. Brad, feel free to go first.
You kind of mentioned it at the beginning, and we've talked about the work that the New Market Tax Credit Working Group has done. I think that there is a tremendous amount of resources and collaboration with all various members of the New Market Tax Credit community. And as Rebecca mentioned, oftentimes there are things that we find and provide to our members ahead of when they may be publicly available or address issues before they may be publicly available. So I think there's a lot of benefit there. And I think for most, we try to share those as well with outside of our membership, but I think that kind of the ability to be on the leading edge of some of that information has proven to be very helpful to our members.
Rebecca?
And I think the other thing is, Brad and I are always available for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to call us or email us. And I also just want to invite everyone to our upcoming conference in June. We'll be in DC. And so I think it'll be, again, a great opportunity to kind of see where we are with budget and to see also just everyone in the industry. There's so much activity happening right now. It's a great opportunity to network and certainly learn more. If you're new and you think we've been talking a different language this whole time, I am going to be doing a pre-conference workshop on Wednesday, June 4th. So come join if you are like, I haven't scared you off yet. You're interested in new markets. You want to keep this going. We do a great workshop and it's a lot of fun. Great way to start the conference.
Thank you both. I will link to the various items that you both just mentioned, as well as provide your email addresses in today's show notes. Before we get to our off mic section, I do want to remind our audience to subscribe to the podcast on the various platforms that you get your podcasts. Those of you watching on YouTube, I'd encourage you to like and comment on the video. That helps raise our visibility, helps others in the new market tax credit community hear and see important discussions like the one Rebecca, Brad, and I are having here today. I also encourage you to share the podcast with colleagues. It's a great way for your colleagues to learn more about the topics we cover on Tax Credit Tuesday, such as the new market tax credit, as well as the many other incentives that we do discuss on the podcast every week. And as I say, most weeks, we do have a full archive of episodes available on the website at novoco.com. And with that, I want to turn to our off mic section. We like to use this space to give a shout out to others who are working in the tax incentive space. It's an opportunity for us to highlight, someone or someones that are worthy and deserve and have earned recognition. Rebecca, with that as the introduction, I'll let you start. Who would you like to shout out?
I have a group to shout out to. So as I mentioned, many of us will be in DC in June for our conference, and a lot of CDEs use their time wisely. They're efficient, and they go ahead and set up meetings with their members of Congress to talk to them about projects being done in their communities. So huge shout out to all of those who have already set up those meetings. I think they're absolutely critical. If you haven't, then this is my challenge to you. don't be scared to do it. This is exactly why we have our members of Congress. They want that connection back to their community. And certainly when great things are being done, they would love to say, hey, I was part of that and I support new markets. So if you haven't set up meetings, go do this now. We've got lots of resources on our website. So if you need anything, check us out and let us help in the process.
And I echo that. Brad?
Yeah, that's a great shout out, Rebecca. This week, my shout out is to Alex Smith, who is the new Deputy Assistant Secretary of Community and Economic Development at the Treasury. Alex oversees the CDFI Fund, which we talked about a lot today. And we enjoyed working with her already and learning more about what her goals are for the CDFI Fund. So just want to shout out her willingness to be open and transparent with us in those conversations, as I think it's important for, the administration and Treasury to be able to share that with the industry. As I mentioned, there's always a lot of anxiety in our industry, and any transparency is always much appreciated. So thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Let me also echo your shout out to Alex. We appreciate your government service and look forward to continuing to work with you and the rest of Treasury to make the new market tax credit an ever more effective tool for community development. Brad and Rebecca, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Yes.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.